So I will just briefly introduce now the special issue before I give the floor to our contributors. And let me start with some facts and figures that many of us are quite acquainted with, but maybe there are those who are not. And according to UNHCR statistics, at mid-2023, there are 110 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. 63.5 million of them are internally displaced people. 6.1 million are asylum seekers, 36.4 million are refugees, and 5.3 million are people in need of international protection. And again, according to UNHCR 2022 figures, around 69% of refugees and asylum seekers are hosted in countries neighboring their country of origin, and about 74% of them are hosted in low and middle income countries without much prospect for a permanent legal status. And this same applies for many who somewhat were able to reach through some sort of temporary safety in a rather high income country in Europe or elsewhere. Our special issue focuses on humanitarian migrants that includes but are not limited to only those registered at the UNHCR, nonetheless are on the move in search of safety, and those who are faced with co-occurrence of a protection gap and an enforcement gap. Before going into what we mean by protection and enforcement gap, let me briefly explain why we refer to them as humanitarian migrants. This comes from policy and scholarly debates on migration, which often entails a persistent binary between voluntary and forced migrants. And this duality is very much nurtured by the political refugee versus economic migrant divide that the post-World War II international migration and refugee regimes put in place. And this has been come under critique from many scholars, and we are aiming to build on and go beyond this in this special issue by embracing a migrant-centered rather than a legal policy-centered perspective. That would then take into account multiple forms of insecurities that make people decide to move out of their homelands. We think only such an approach would allow for a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of people seeking international protection. There are similar notions such as survival migration or crisis migration, but we use the concept of humanitarian migrants that is developed by Catherine Taleras and her colleagues to stress the notion of a person in search of international protection for various humanitarian reasons, including socioeconomic and political ones. Such humanitarian rationales may not all fit in the conventional legal definition of a refugee because the legal category is either too narrow or simply non-existent in many host country contexts. We therefore take humanitarian migrants not as a fixed legal category, but rather as a heuristic social scientific concept that is attentive to the structural conditions and factors that lead people to migrate, including war and lack of social, economic, or political safety. And in doing so, we hope to draw attention to the increasing irregularization of humanitarian migrants and try to discuss lasting migrant-centered solutions. Now, what do we mean by irregularization of humanitarian migrants, and what do we mean by lasting solutions? As I just noted, the contributions show that humanitarian migrants find themselves in these gaps between narrowing legal protection, the protection gap, and expanded migration law enforcement practices, the enforcement gap. The protection gap entails the legal notion of a refugee, which excludes many types of humanitarian migration that I just described. And increasingly restrictive migration policies and return-oriented post-arrival responses lead to securitization of migration increasingly. And this makes humanitarian migrants vulnerable to chain refoulement or post-deportation risks. In response to refugee crisis since 2015 in the EU and its neighborhood or Central America or Southeast Asia, there have been some global promising actions, such as the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants in 2016, as well as the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which was signed 5 years ago today, and Global Compact on Refugees signed 5 years, 2 days ago. However, on the one hand, especially the Global Compact on Migration has met with unease and even backlash from far-right actors throughout Europe. We also see that these instruments, these non-binding instruments, have already been criticized by many scholars for prioritizing migrants' concerns over people's rights to protection and mobility. In relation to the enforcement gap, studies have shown that there has been a tendency among states to make it harder to immigrate without a residence permit or renewing permits. So these restrictive migration and integration pathways, unsurprisingly, don't stop migration, but lead to increased undocumented stays. And in addition to that, recent research that also my co-editors of the special issue, Dr. Marieke van Houte and Dr. Arjen Leerkes has conducted across Europe, reveals that the capacity and or political interest to enforce the removal of irregularly staying migrants is diverse, and overall it is very limited. Building on these previous and ongoing discussions on durable solutions for displacement, especially guided by the question of who are durable solutions for, this special issue takes a critical look at various policy responses to irregularized humanitarian migrants who end up in a limbo between political discourse of increased migration enforcement and de facto non-return. A limbo with very limited room for maneuvering only feeds into irregularization of people's legal status through social exclusion policies that then deny them the right to work, housing, education, or access to health. The contributions of this special issue primarily are based on the result of a two-day workshop that I held together with Dr. Marieke van Houte and Dr. Arjen Leerkes back in 2020 in January at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam within the framework of a Horizon project, a research social platform on migration and asylum. The workshop and the Horizon project brought together academics, policy actors, and practitioners in the field of migration and asylum to discuss the current challenges, such as durable solutions for irregularized humanitarian migration. And the three main questions that were discussed at the workshop, and also our special issue is based on, are as follows. What policy approaches have been formulated to deal with irregularization of humanitarian migration, and what are the outcomes? Second, what rationales, legal, institutional, economic, cultural, historical, explain these differences, different approaches towards irregularized migration? And third, how should more durable solutions for irregularized humanitarian migrants be imagined and defined? And we will now go to our contributors to hear from them very briefly about their articles and their key messages. And I will introduce each one of them in the order they speak. Let me turn now to our first speaker, Dr. Rossella Marino. Dr. Marino is a postdoctoral assistant at the Department of Social Work and Social Pedagogy at Ghent University, and associate research fellow at the United Nations University in Bruges. Dr. Marino will briefly introduce us their article titled "At the Crossroads Between Care and Control, a Cross-Country Comparison of Assisted Return." This article is co-authored with Arla Manersu, Ines Francisco, and Ine Lietard.
Thank you very much, Zeynep. Thank you to all the contributors and the editors of the special issue, and to all the people that are joining in today. The article deals with assisted voluntary return, which is a program that facilitates the return of irregularized migrants or humanitarian migrants without a right to protection home. It is a comparative study, so we selected countries that are comparatively less explored to look at how they configure assisted return, because there's quite some deal of harmonization at the European level, but still different countries implement the measure differently. So we selected Finland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the UK. And we developed a particular comparative framework, which is composed of different layers. We looked at the regulatory layer, so looking at the policies and regulations that configure assisted return at the national level, the organizational layer, so looking at the actors that implement the measure, and the practical layer, looking at the counseling strategies of social workers implementing the measure. And we didn't just stop at comparatively describing the layers of the measure, but we also utilized a core analytical concept, which is the nexus between care and control. So we wanted to see which logic between care and control takes the upper hand in a particular country, in a particular layer of assisted return. And finally, we realized that it's very hard to establish whether care or control takes the upper hand unless we take into account the structural condition of irregularization in which humanitarian migrants find themselves in. Just to give a very brief example, for example, we looked at eligibility criteria. So southern countries tend to have wider eligibility criteria, so giving access to the measure also to people that have never passed through the asylum system. And this would mean, of course, a wide access to assistance in the case of return assistance. But if assisted return also aims at disciplining the mobility of these humanitarian migrants, then the discipline is also enlarged the more people are involved in the measure. And the reverse is true for northern countries that have a more limited accessibility criteria and therefore only give access to the measure to, for example, rejected asylum seekers. So also as sort of like a takeaway point for policymakers or organizations, it is very important to take into account the structural context of mobility injustice characterizing the condition of humanitarian migrants without a right to protection, because otherwise even programs that entail some kind of assistance may turn into tools of disciplining the mobility of these individuals. Thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions later on.
Xander is a PhD candidate here at ISS, and Xander will briefly introduce us the article titled "Safe for Whom? A Human Security Perspective on Nigeria as a Safe Country of Origin." This article is co-authored together with me and my colleague, Dr. Shyamika Jayasundara-Smith, also from ISS.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zeynep, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to share with you all the key insights from the research, which looked at the framing of return migration to Nigeria from Ireland and the EU. We took the time frame of 2000 to 2022, which means that we included the periods around the 2001 readmission agreement made between Ireland and Nigeria, as well as the rising role of international organizations, particularly the IOM, for facilitating return. Through the human security framework and its 7 dimensions, namely the economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political security, we showed how human needs can be taken seriously into migration governance. This happens alongside the work of other scholars who have already demonstrated how human security serves as a means to both realize human rights and can be implemented into both policy through adapting existing frameworks. In this case, it took the shape of challenging the depiction of Nigeria as a safe country of origin suitable for these readmission agreements, as well as the returns being compliant with non-refoulement as the human rights principle of non-harm upon return. Interestingly, we found the main discussions by the Irish and Nigerian media outlets alongside EU IOM promotional material did not acknowledge the dimensions of food or environmental security whatsoever, despite evidence that there was increasing insecurity within these domains. This is particularly worrisome as the domains of both food and environment are crucial for the enjoyment of everyday life and the avoidance of harm. So this tells us that people who are returned were likely returned to a place where they might need to migrate again or use another livelihood strategy to respond to these insecure conditions, thus challenging both the safe and successful nature of these returns. In this discussion, we saw 3 main discourses around Nigeria. At first, from 2000 to 2016, there was a consensus that Nigeria was unsafe for return, with a lot of reportage on the different insecurity there. For instance, in 2010, one migrant interviewed by Irish media said that receiving a deportation order was like having a death sentence over their head. Moving forward in 2016 onwards, the framing splintered, with Nigeria being presented both as safe and unsafe, unified by presenting return as an acceptable policy regardless. Return to an unsafe Nigeria was depicted as acceptable when, on the one hand, it came as retribution for an unauthorized migration or assisted with the development of the country, or on the other hand, as a return to a home and improved conditions compared to the arduous undocumented journey. Returning to a safe Nigeria was presented by downplaying the impact of Boko Haram, as well as promoting the success of assisted voluntary return and reintegration programs. In any case, through a human security lens and in alignment with numerous reports, return to Nigeria in these timeframes was likely to be met with avoidable harm, particularly in the domains of food, health, environment, political, personal, and community insecurity. In this way, our study calls for a more encompassing, human-centric, migrant-centric understanding of what constitutes a safe or successful return. Thank you.
Now we turn to our third speaker, Dr. Jill Alpes. Jill is a senior researcher at Ghent University Human Rights Center, and she will briefly introduce us their article titled "Who Owns the Future of Syrians in Lebanon? Intimate Family Explorations of Refugees' Own Search for Durable Solutions." And this is a co-authored article together with Kıvamo Efa Föke, Marieke van Houte, Şahed Ksebi, and Belal Şukayer.
Thank you, Zeynep. I'm happy to present this in the name of all my co-authors. So when we look at policy approaches for Syrians in Lebanon, then return is very much the favored future imagined for refugees. And our main finding in our article is that Syrians do not want to return with dignity, they want to return to dignity. Thus, our alternative policy suggestion is to invest into dignity and to really take seriously what this means, what dignity really means, regardless of whether this implies a geographical return or not. So what did we do concretely in order to come to this finding and this policy proposal? So we deployed Futures Literacy Labs as a participatory and capability-based research methodology that allows participants to become the researchers of their own lives. It's a method that has been developed by Futurists at UNESCO, and the method consists of games and creative exercises that stimulate the participants to express themselves in an open manner about their hopes, fears, and possibilities, and it follows a three-step pedagogical journey. So we did this for 3 families for respectively 3 days. And our results is that that this method really provides very interesting insights for researchers, but it also provides the research participants, so the lab participants, with the cognitive space and agency needed to go beyond foreclosed decision making. And we've seen really interesting shifts and examples. And this capacity to go beyond foreclosed decision making processes is the capacity of being futures literature. So it is in and of itself also a durable solution. So let me give you one example. There was a woman who stood up on the first day of our lab and she said, I will go home. I want to return to Syria. I know it means that I risk being detained, but I want my children to have access to education. They can't have access to education in Lebanon, so I will risk detention. I don't care. I will return to Syria. We went through the 3-day journey of the lab, and on the last day, this woman in her 40s stood up and she said, I give myself permission to invest into my own education right here and now. And so it is a massive shift, and I think quite a powerful example of what it can mean to work with people to understand and explore together what a return to dignity can mean, and to really give people also the space and the time and the energy to discover it for themselves. So this is just one of the many powerful examples that we've had. I could tell you many more, but I invite you to go into the article and to discover the stories of the Karames and the Ksebis yourself. What do these stories, which you can discover in the paper, what does it mean concretely for return and durable solutions? So what really it means is that there is an important emotional dimension to return aspirations. And without taking seriously the emotional dimension, we cannot pretend, neither as researchers nor as policymakers, that we know whether or that we can, through an interview or a survey, know whether people want to return or not. So this emotional dimension to return aspirations needs to be worked with. Futures Literacy Labs are a wonderful method to do that. And then we can unravel under what conditions the return to dignity can be combined or not with a geographical return. So Futures Literacy Labs alone can, of course, not radically change structural injustice or hegemonic frameworks. But what we saw with the families with which we carried out these labs is that they're mobilized after the lab an increased capacity to identify themselves opportunities to own and shape their futures. And this is why it is also an interesting tool for policymakers to work with, because then there is a way to co-establish and co-decide what that means. And there are examples in the paper of very small things that can be done and that are achievable and realistic here and now. So yeah, I'm happy to if there's any questions, I'm happy, of course, to discuss the how we came to the conclusion that that the most important thing is a return to dignity and not with dignity, and how Futures Literacy Lab can help really researchers, policymakers, and displaced people to work out together what that return to dignity can mean.
Now I turn to Francesco Tonnarelli to finish the first part. Francesco is a PhD candidate at Tallinn University of Technology and an urban development specialist at UN Habitat. He kindly stepped in for Charlotte Mon, who's the co-author of the piece, who's in the flyers you might have seen. Francesco will present the paper titled From Dadaab Camp to Kismayo City, a call for local evidence to inform durable solutions. This paper is co-authored with Charlotte Mon, Jonathan Weber, Winston Juguna, and Abdirahman Barkadli.
Yes, thank you, Zeynep, and thank you, everybody, for joining. So this article is based on and also reflects upon our direct experiences working with UN Habitat, both in Dadaab refugee camp and in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya and the town of Kismayo in Somalia. So looking at the two sides of the border and the experiences of local integration of refugees on one side and IDPs and returnees on the other. What we wanted to do was to reflect on a type of intervention at the interface between humanitarian development aid, that is the planning of refugees or returnees, IDPs, settlements, as not only logistic facilities of temporary care, but also as settlements which, in a way or another, are doomed to become permanent. For the case of Dadaab, it has been there for 30 years, so I think it's one of the most famous examples of that. So this type of settlements need to be planned as hybrids, which on one side cater for particular vulnerabilities of their inhabitants, but on the other, they need to be also thought as urban centers, which can become supportive of integration and long-term well-being, not only of the inhabitants, but also of the communities surrounding them. So we wanted to investigate whether through these hybrid settlements, it's possible to leverage the huge investment of humanitarian development aid on one side to achieve cost-effective solution, which not only reach direct so-called beneficiaries, but also the broader audience of the communities surrounding the settlements, which are like so-called host communities. And then how this spillover effect of aid can be directed towards a broader area and a population, so helping the local integration and also the social economic development of the whole area. So eventually trying to reduce aid dependency and also trigger some sort of economic development. And what we've seen in Dadaab and Kismayo, and you can, I hope, read the paper, looks very promising, and even brought the local governments to scale up these strategies, including them in regional urban strategic planning. In case of Dadaab and also Kakuma, which is the other refugee camp, the success of these camps and their surrounding has also helped in the advocacy of the new refugee law, which was approved a couple of years ago. But all these efforts needs to be come together with a substantive investment in connectivity, services, housing, and also they need to be integrated with very very in-depth urban planning and governance to direct and promote in the right direction these spillovers. So a much more in-depth and localized response compared to the usual UN-led operations that we continue to see everywhere. So there must be much more research into these dynamics and approaches, and also what brings the local and the national governments to actually accept them, because in other countries it's completely different. I've also been in Cox's Bazar, which is probably the opposite. I'll stop here.
Now I turn to Dr. Zeynep Mencutek. I will briefly introduce her also. Zeynep is a senior researcher at Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies. And she's also a research affiliate with Canadian Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Zeynep conducts joint research on the thematic areas of governance of migration in a globalizing world there. Zeynep is currently co-coordinating the Horizon project titled Decentering the Study of Migrant Returns and Return Policies, and in short, GAPS. So she's very well placed to comment on this special issue, and we're very honored and happy to have her here. Zeynep, let's hear first your first reactions to these first four papers that are mainly focusing on return and reintegration before we move on to the second part.
Thanks, Zeynep. Thanks also everyone to be in the workshop, and this is impressive special issue. I'm very honored to read to the pieces and have a chance to be reflected on, actually, and also showing the growing interest onto the reconsidering the durable solutions and pieces. Each of them are inviting us to paying attention to the different angles of this debate, but specifically within the durable solution to the return one, which seems the most kind of the favorite one and one of the most discussed one. But the value of the special issue is we don't not only learn from what the states want, but also the pieces are asking us to think about what are the humanitarian migrants want and what are their own aspirations, what are their imaginations about this durable solution. I think this is a very fair call, and also kind of fitting with what we are calling right now in our project GAPS, the decentering to the return. We want to be really decentered, not only in terms of the geographies we are looking and going beyond to the EU to understand the topic, but also to looking at the real stakeholders of these debates, the migrants and civil society, and going beyond to the state. What is a solution for whom? Solution for states, or the solution for migrants, or solution for families? And I should also underline the methodological richness of the special issue, and because this methodological richness bringing us more empirical insights into the migration studies, and deeper looking at the different pathways, not only the one pathway, but also the different pathways of the topic. And we listened about the comparative cross-country case, capacity-based participatory action, the discourse analysis, and the case studies. And also, I'm impressed with this conceptual engagement and also the novelty in the pieces, such as the Rossella's work and her colleagues' work on this instincting and extincting humanitarians. Just talks about framework for future studies and engaged relationality. Actually, there are a few points I think they need a little maybe more delving in the further studies, such as this engaged relationality in the Gilles paper. My question to her will be about that, and one more question. And also, I see in the Xander's and his colleagues' work, these nefarious silences, which I found a quite interesting concept, but it comes just in the conclusion. Probably a new paper is coming about it, but I want to get some hints about, what you mean in this silence, because right now in the current political environment, and also when it comes to the migrants' returns and the deportation, these silences is part of part of the landscape, let's put it this way. And also the studies confirms what we know about some policy tools like assistant return policies, and it says us that yes, they don't that much work as they are assumed. From here, not to launching the discussion, but I will pose a questions to each colleague, and starting with the Rossella. And actually, in your the very rich comparative study, you talked about some problems and the challenges in these assistant return programs. Actually, in our recent project, and the completed one as well, we found the similar problems in these assistant return programs. But at the same time, I see that policy makers, such as in German case, I'm in Germany, they have a very strong belief to these assistant return mechanisms, and they see it as a kind of a silver, something will solve everything. And I want to to ask you about this assumption and what we can do, as a researchers to challenge. And also I am wondering, as you look at the comparative cases, is there any type of learning among cases, the ones you looked at, policy learning? This is the first question. I mean, this is a question for Rossella and for Gilles. And I very much, to appreciated your focus on how we can translate our findings into let's say how we fit the policy with our findings. And also I understood this, your focus is also in this dignity, in the returns and return to the dignity. Our research, for instance, also to show that the migrants wants to decide their future and their kids' future and follow up their aspirations. But my question is to that, how we translate these findings to the beyond our research circles. Let's put in this way, in the local context, for instance, in the Lebanon case or beyond. Xander, as I asked, I'm wondering about these nefarious silences in your case, and also this for the Francesco. You talked about this humanitarian spillover thing in the camp settings, but I am wondering how there is also this humanitarian dependency and aid dependency discussion, right? In another circles. I am more than that. I am wondering how this model can be think into the urban refugee, because considering that many of the refugees are the urban refugees and irregular migrants are in urban, in the global south and in the global north. And do you think that your findings are really camp specific, or can we expand them to understand other the places? I'm gonna stop here. I hope I didn't talk too much.
I would like to continue with the second part now. Let me introduce Theresa Schütze. Theresa is a researcher at the University of Continuing Education Krems Center for Migration and Globalization Research. Theresa will present her paper titled The Non-Status of Duldung, Non-Deportability in Germany and the Politics of Limitless Temporariness. Theresa.
Thank you very much. So I think I can relate very well to this, to the question of solution for whom that Zeynep just raised, because my article actually investigates one specific form of dealing with non-deportability or non-deportable irregularized migrants, which are limbo statuses. And specifically, it looks at the case of the German Duldung. And the Duldung is a so-called temporary suspension of deportation. It was introduced in 1965. And it practically means that it formally recognizes the mere presence of an irregularized migrant, while the obligation of that migrant to leave the country remains intact, which means that the stay is still illegalized and there's a continued imminent possibility of deportation. And so what the paper does is it sketches a historic trajectory of the status of Duldung, its policies and politics surrounding it, which has been around for 6 decades, so quite a long time. And this serves to illustrate, on the one hand, the embeddedness of the policies of Duldung in the specific German migration regime and its broader historic developments, and highlights the importance of some historical events. But on the other hand, the article aims to discuss different functions of limbo statuses through the case of the Duldung, which transcend the German context, I would argue. And one very central feature of the Duldung is what I call the fiction of temporary stay, which means that the Duldung is designed as an interim status, and it is supposed to be temporary, but often it is not. Very often it is not. So in regard to the very question that the special issue poses, the article makes an analytical distinction between the concept of durability and the concept of persistence, which I think is important here, because I argue that beyond the quality of Duldung as a long-standing and a very institutionalized governance tool, or a very persistent governance tool, we could say a durable solution would imply a desirable outcome also from a humanitarian and from a social cohesion perspective. And that is at last momentarily not the case with the Duldung, I would argue. So overall, the paper concludes quite critically that the Duldung enables systematic disenfranchisement through this de facto use of or limitless use of a provision. but it also tries to finish with some concrete vision of what could make the Duldung a more durable tool, which would mean to necessarily break this grip of the fiction of temporary stay and its problematic consequences, and it would require a substantive limitation of temporariness. And I think one very concrete example of this would mean a continuous and more broadly accessible regularization options, and also very importantly, access to social and economic rights after a certain period of time. Yes, I think I will stop here and maybe discuss some more aspects later.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Now I turn to Dr. Dimitris Iraklis. Dimitris is a research fellow at the University of Milan, and he will present their paper titled Debordering Solidarity, Civil Society Actors Assisting Refused Asylum Seekers in Small Cities. The paper is co-authored together with Professor Maurizio Ambrosini.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and present the results of a long fieldwork within the Horizon 2020 MAGIC project. The idea behind this article was to investigate the effects of the activities developed by various social actors from the civil society in favor of non-deported refused asylum seekers in political terms. So what was the effects of these activities in political terms? So my colleague Maurizio and I drew on qualitative data collected in two small Italian cities ruled by anti-immigrant coalitions, and we analyzed different forms of support, such as provision of basic needs, legal advice, and practical help, while migrants were trying to access welfare services and rights. The analysis of the rationales of migrant supporters and the outcomes of their practices showed that even though some acts can reproduce border regimes, so reproduce, let's say, distinctions among migrants through socio-legal constructs of deservingness, for instance, we argue that everyday acts of what we call debordering solidarity, so we call this kind of activities as debordering solidarity activities. So these activities can entail political and cultural meanings within local environments that are hostile towards migrants. Our analysis also showed that despite the fact that NGOs may receive public funds to offer services to migrants, this does not entail collaboration with the authorities to report undocumented migrants, as argued in previous research, for instance. In terms of durable solutions, we suggest that an increasing recognition of civil society actors as relevant partners of public authorities can generate positive outcomes. For instance, NGOs and other organizations can function as institutions that are able to provide ideas and suggestions to state authorities, thus contributing, let's say, to some responses related to the issues of migrants who do not have a right to stay. Despite the discussion on Duldung and what happens and critical also reflection on what happens in Germany, we added that in a country such as Italy, where there is no legal channel for these and no opportunity for these migrants to get a regular status, we think that opportunities for vocational training and internship can be a further measure to facilitate integration of irregularized migrants in the labor market. So in this case, civil society actors can contribute to financing such activities through fundraising, for instance, or they can help migrants to access jobs and housing by reinforcing contacts between migrants and locals. I stop here, and I'm happy to discuss more in depth whatever may be of your interest.
Now we move to Professor Deniz Sert. Deniz is Jamune Chair on Migration Studies at Özyeğin University, Istanbul, and she will present their article titled Non-Deport to Discipline, The Daily Life of Afghans in Turkey. The article is co-authored together with Dr. Sibel Karadağ.
Well, our study explores the politics of non-deportability, non is in parentheses, because Afghans are actually deported from Turkey. Nowadays, even more so because of the upcoming local elections. So the politics of non-deportability and the everyday strategies employed by Afghans, how they deal with deportability in Turkey. This was the main focus. The findings suggest that the informal labor market and the clan-based, like ethnicity-based, we could say, background play crucial roles in shaping the experiences of Afghans in Turkey. What are the main factors of the politics of non-deportation? Well, the first one, the most important one, I guess, is the needs and interests of the informal labor market. We have a very huge informal labor market in Turkey, which accounts for a significant portion of the total labor force and plays a crucial role in shaping the politics of non-deportation for Afghans, where the informal labor market's demand for labor from displaced communities, including Afghans, influences the tolerance and hidden nature of their presence and mobility in the country, unless, I should underline, there are security concerns or macro-level political issues arise. The second important factor shaping the politics of non-deportability is state capacity and symbolic power. While limited state capacity and difficulties in managing deportation procedures may partly explain the tolerance of irregularized Afghans, the symbolic role of detainability and deportability as a spectacle of state enforcement also contributes to the politics of non-deportation in Turkey. This is something that we are still, as I said before the local elections in Turkey, we are still witnessing here. And the third one is ethnic kinship and community ties. Our study highlights the importance of ethnic kinship and community ties, particularly for Uzbeks and Turkmens within the Afghan community, in shaping the experiences of Afghans in Turkey. This is very much related to speaking the language, because if they are coming from Uzbek or Turkmen background, they have language affinity. Ethnic kinship claims can give individuals a privileged status, reflecting the hierarchy within the marginality of Afghans and echoing the Turkish state's historical attitudes shaped around nationalist sentiments, we could say. When we look at these factors collectively, they all contribute to the complex dynamics surrounding the politics of non-deportation for Afghans in Turkey, reflecting the interplay between state interests, labor market demands, and ethnic and community ties. And I'll leave it here for the Q&A. Thank you.
Last but not least, Dr. Monika Szulecka. She's a researcher based in the Institute of Law Studies in Polish Academy of Sciences. Monika presents now the paper titled Departing or Being Deported, Poland's Approach Towards Humanitarian Migrants, co-authored together with Dr. Witold Klaus.
Thank you very much. So in the paper reflecting the situation of Poland, we used the concept of deportheid proposed by Barak Kalir to study the policies and practices of the Polish state towards irregularized humanitarian migrants. We used to do this, we used empirical data, and what we saw, we expected this, and what we saw the huge efforts of the state to prevent arrival of humanitarian migrants. So the solution, if we refer to the question about solution for whom, so the solution for the host state was to prevent, to do everything not to allow these people arrive in the territory, so to avoid problems. And the second practice that we saw with regard to humanitarian migrants in the Polish case was putting efforts in making people depart themselves, not to execute forced departures, because of the fact that usually removals from the country were impossible. But the state practices based on not encouraging or informal encouragement to move forward, not necessarily to the country of origin, that we observed in this study, convinced us that the solutions that the state, the persistent solutions that we can see here, and that are solutions for the state, are not solutions for migrants, because migrants still are in irregular situation, irregular position, and for forced or forced to move onwards because they cannot wait for any protection or any kind of regularization in Poland, or prevented to enter Polish territory. However, Polish legislation allow regularization of and give some solutions that could be treated as durable solutions for humanitarian migrants. This is the permit to stay for humanitarian reasons. However, the problem is that, and we tried to prove this in our article, the problem is that these humanitarian reasons are not recognized in case of some groups. That's why when we see the cultural aspects or religious aspects indicated by state authorities as factors that should be taken into account when admitting migrants or not admitting, but at the same time ignoring the humanitarian needs of some groups of migrants. In the Polish case, these were especially before 2021, when we had bigger pressure at the Polish-Belarusian border, and 2022, when we admitted millions of Ukrainian refugees. So this the policy of deterrence referred mostly to people from other countries that Belarus and Ukraine. And what we see as solutions by the state, they as durable solutions by the state for humanitarian migrants, they are, let's say, designed mostly for these groups from neighboring countries, Belarusians and Ukrainians. What is needed is to take into account the humanitarian needs and the situations of people who are from other countries, let's say more distance, also in cultural or religious terms. So it means the need to challenge the common narratives which are based on denying even the right to access asylum in Poland. Thank you for now, and I will be very happy to discuss more if there are any questions. Thank you so much.
For me, the kind of, let's say, the common thread is that there are this spectrum of the temporary measures, from Duldung to the temporary protection in Turkey, or the temporary protection in the Ukrainian cases and others. And very consistent attempt to do keeping the people in this temporariness, in the words of the Theresa, this limitless temporariness in different cases, which seems to that the commonality among the cases. Also, the relevance of the neoliberal economic goals seems that this case in Turkey, also it is in the case in Germany, although they look like the different political regimes and these and that, but these the relevance of these labor markets needs for this exploitation of the migrants and specifically those in the irregularized humanitarian migrants. This seems relevant regardless of the geography. Either is it the Pakistan or Iran or Turkey or Germany. And also this stratified rights for and selectiveness in whom to give a protection, whom to enforce. I mean, it's bringing us to your point about this enforcement gap and also the protection gap. And both for the enforcement and the protection, it seems there's this selectiveness is occurring here and there in Poland and all elsewhere. And the one, maybe the positive papers is the Iraklis and his colleagues' papers about these some promise coming from the local actors, which is, but although it has some limits, but we have these promises. But I will not pose the questions the colleagues to give the audience to the chance. But just I'm wondering, is there any lessons learn from the historically, because in the introduction you said that you bring into the historical dimensions as well in some papers. I am wondering, is there any hope in the history we can, to take for regularization or for other, or amnesty or something we can, to get in? Also, the one general question is that, okay, this temporariness and the flexibility of the policies and instrumentalization of the policies is not that much good. But at the same time, it gives some, also the room for maneuver to the migrants to navigate to stay for a long time and to navigate despite all these, these violations of human rights and exploitations in the labor market? And should we move to the more, the other way around, this is more restrictiveness, right? This is also this your point about these strategic interconnections between the tolerated state and enforced return. Maybe the colleagues can reflect on it. And thanks for giving me a chance to reflect on and all these great papers. I invite colleagues and the audience to read them.
My name is Shaden Sabouni. I'm a PhD student at Fulda University. I don't have a question, actually. I just want to comment on Dr. Gill's paper. Thank you very much for this very interesting topic. I'm studying Syrian refugees in Germany as well, and my topic is about home and belonging. So it's about where is home and where do they belong to, and I'm still at it's a progress. My research is still on progress, but I can relate a lot to your paper and what you have said, that they want to go with dignity or to dignity, not with dignity, because for them there is no home. Though that they have acquired some kind of academic education, vocational training, a lot of them, they do wish to go back to Syria, but they can't because they say all what we have achieved here will not be acknowledged there, or we cannot do anything with our with what we have already achieved and what we have done. There is no clear idea about where home is because they cannot belong here and they cannot go back there at the same time, because as you have mentioned, there are no integration or reintegration programs that can send those refugees, though that they are not refugees anymore. A lot of them has acquired European nationalities. They still would like to go back, but they can't because they don't know what they can do if they went back to Syria. So just a comment. Thank you very much for your research. I've already uploaded your paper and I cannot wait to read it.
Great, thank you. Shall we now then turn back to the authors in the same order to react to the questions and the comments from Zeynep, and then there are some, of course, directed at in general, thinking about regularization. And I see in the chat also a comment came from this colleague from PICOM who had to leave on a similar direction, so we can also take this up on board, whoever wants to, or I will address it later. So let's now go back to our first speaker, Rossella.
Yes, thank you so much, Zeynep, for the comments and the questions. So first of all, you were asking how is it possible the policymakers still put so much emphasis and effort in assisted return, although there has been so far a lot of research indeed demonstrating and manifesting all the limitations of this program. Normally, we will say that policymakers are interested in the advantages of assisted return, which is cheaper than deportation and less politically controversial. But at the same time, to this point, really the evidence of the so many different challenges and negative aspects of this measure are so big that still it is incredible that although it's true disadvantages are there, policymakers are still not listening to evidence coming from academia. So I cannot really respond to that. Maybe it should be the topic of further research. How is it possible the policymakers insist on assisted return so much still? And turning to the question on what can be learned from the different countries, because what we did, I repeat, was a comparative study. There's many things that can be learned. First of all, for example, avoiding in counseling to illegalized migrants, bringing up the possibility of deportation in order to actually push them or encourage them into taking up assisted return, for example, because that's a very clear manifestation of control in assisted return. Or, for example, linking assisted return and deportation very much also in the institutional organization of these two measures that we have identified in certain countries and in general. And so I link also to regularization, and I close here, increasing viable opportunities for irregularized migrants beyond returning. So indeed, pushing for the opportunities for regularization, especially if CSOs and some of the respondents have told us that recognize that there's no convinced manifestation of a willingness to return. Maybe the irregularized person is unsure, is confused, bringing up the possibility for regularization, or basically, for example, sending the person to another service that may have the right tools to help the person in the particular condition they find themselves in. So these are a bit of the key points there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Xander?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Zeynep, for the question on the silences. I'll try to keep it short so everybody else can also answer, but it mainly concerns the environmental and the food dimensions. So they're not mentioned at all. And so the other dimensions were either mentioned to say that, okay, it's secure enough, or to say it's not secure. So especially like the economic security was really stressed over and over again throughout the various sources, whereas the individual, community, political, and health insecurity get a lot more attention. And particularly that health insecurity upon return was really frequently discussed. But in all of this, nobody talks at all about the environment that they would be returned to, or about the food, the access to food that they would have. And so, yeah, for the silences, I am interested going forward in my PhD looking at this, particularly in the environment. But so I think it's really interesting. And I think that the last point I make is that this comes from the human security perspective. So when you take a human security perspective towards non-refoulement, you would be able to see these dimensions that kind of get left out of more rights-based approaches. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your question, Zeynep, and also Shaden Zabouni. I already dropped my email address so that we can talk more bilaterally. So I'll keep it short. Two things. Engaged relationality. So it's really about not presupposing that we as researchers can access information through interviews or even observation, but really reckoning and starting with the hegemony of like certain discourses and also the trauma, and thus taking responsibility as researchers not to extract information, but to co-create conditions of possibility for mutual learning and discovery. And Futures Literacy Labs are one method to do that, but there are other creative methods to do that. And this co-creation of the conditions of possibility for discovery is in and of itself, both the process and what comes out of it, a durable solution. And just as an example, we did one lab, and then that led to another 3 labs, and then actually 2 of the co-facilitators got their own funding with the foundation to do more, because they were so motivated to do these, because they saw what impact it had on people who participated in these labs. Which leads me to the second question, because you were like, oh, it's like really beautiful, idealistic research, but like, what on earth does this mean concretely for a policymaker? So Futures Literacy Labs come from prospection. So that is, it's an interventionist field. So it's first an intervention, and then we made it into a research method. So very concretely, policymakers can fund Futures Literacy Lab as a durable solution, because it creates a capacity that enables the participants, the Syrians, other refugees, to own their futures. That's why we asked this question in the beginning: who owns the future of Syrians? Well, Futures Literacy Labs can, be an empowering tool to cut through some of the structural limitations. And then secondly, what can policymakers do? Well, they can also initiate Futures Literacy Lab with Syrians so as to co-design future-proof policies together. And that actually then links me back to what Leticia from PICOM was saying in the chat about, why are you not discussing regularization? Why is this issue on sustainable solutions so return heavy? So Futures Literacy Labs is also a method to co-design policies. I mean, it's an investment. It takes time, but it's possible, and we've shown in the paper that you can have very concrete outcomes.
Yeah. So I think Zeynep asked me about the scalability, and also how it could be applied to more urban context. So First of all, I think everything started, like the idea of hybrid resettlement started with the recognition that there is a huge investment poured into this type of interventions, which is basically thought to be lost because of the temporality of this site. So the idea, it's just to say, okay, if this is actually also used in helping the area where the site is actually being planned, is actually a better investment. So the very idea is to use this in also urban context and transform the settlements into urban centers. And actually, the case study in Case Mayo is a city extension, so it is right at the edge of the city, and it has become a part of the city in itself. Obviously, if you think about more complex urban settlements and environments, like for example, staying in the same area, Mogadishu or Nairobi, obviously the issues are much more complex. So you don't have to think only about planning a new city, but it's much better to think about having incentives and subsidies for renting, cash-based interventions to support also like the rental market, but also looking into issues of land tenure security, and so on, which are things that actually have been people look into quite a lot from both a practical perspective and a research perspective. I think you've seen maybe the work on refugees economy from the University of Oxford, which is quite interesting. However, I think, and this is one of the points that we raised in the paper, is that it's difficult to understand really what are the conditions where this type of interventions are actually possible. I was mentioning Cox's Bazar, which is a similar context, and actually was a really like the emergency in 2017 happened right after the signature of the Global Compact. So the conditions on paper were perfect to have the bank financing also infrastructure towards with both humanitarian and development purposes. But there, everything just crashed against a political and cultural complete opposition on understanding the refugees as an opportunity. And here we are 6-7 years after, where people are still confined, and the investment, the humanitarian investment is continuing, although is declining, but like is just being used for the continuous maintenance of bamboo shelters that every 2 years we need to repair, paying gas for the refugees because otherwise they cut trees, and also financing a horrible basically a prison in the middle of the Indian Ocean to resettle these people from the Kutupalong in Cox's Bazar. Why this happens, it's difficult to really understand, and it's probably like dependent on so many variables that it's difficult to find the solution for this. But obviously, if you end up in a place where refugees can actually be accepted in urban contexts, as in, for example, in Kenya at the moment with the new refugee law, then actually you can use more advanced urban planning and urban governance tools to make them inside. Basically, you switch from like humanitarian support to actually including them in the normal urban pools in a way. I'll stop here. Sorry, it was a convoluted answer.
Thank you, Francesco. We are moving on to Theresa and the second people who spoke in the second half, and I see a question actually asking about the role, intentions of the policy makers, whether there were any studies, and I think we're actually coming to that part now again, back with Theresa and also with Monika. If there's any more insights that you would like to bring in, please feel free, and otherwise also any reaction that you have to Zeynep's comments or ongoing discussion, please feel free. Theresa, would you like to comment or?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just shortly to relating to Zeynep's comment and questions, I wanted to add that because Zeynep also spoke of the neoliberalization tendency and what we learn historically from, or what we learn from looking at historic solutions, maybe I think one thing is that if there is a neoliberal tendency or a perspective or a function integrated in a migration policy, that doesn't necessarily or makes more opportunity structures for specific people, precarious migrants to work or to do a traineeship or something, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is good for the whole group of precarious migrants, because it's a very specific type of deservingness. I just wanted to add that this is something I learned from looking at it from a historical perspective also. And another thing, more in a positive view, what we can learn is I think the great potential of Limo statuses, or specifically the Duldung, is that it makes that it really institutionally recognizes the void that the enforcement gap in combination with the protection gap creates. And it really makes this contradiction that exists, the contradiction of non-deportability, makes it very visible. And that means that the public or the political debate talks about it. The policymakers talk about it. And that has been the case in Germany for 60 years now, very intense debates. And so I think that's at least something, a big potential there.
Thank you very much. I didn't receive any question, but I would like to, let's say, add something to what Zeynep said before about the role of local actors. And this is an interesting topic. I think there are many, there are a lot of projects now, let's say, focusing on the role of civil society actors and focusing on the local level. And if I can add something to the comment of the one who was asking about the views of policymakers, I think that at the local level, it is very difficult to talk about, let's say, policymakers' initiatives, or let's say policymakers who can, let's say, introduce new measures in order to give solutions or durable solutions for migrants without a legal status. These are some exemptions as far it regards the Italian case, and here the role of civil society organization is very important, because as we argued in the article, everyday acts in favor of irregularized migrants can shape policies at the local level, and can also, let's say, enable the interactions between locals and migrants. So I think that the role of civil society actors is very important. And another thing is I would like to comment is about neoliberal economic goals, labor market insertion of refugees and asylum seekers and those without a regular status. I think that it is very hard for us researchers to, let's say, suggest alternatives and suggest something very, let's say, how to say, different from what is implemented in other states. As I was saying before, for instance, Duldung is criticized in the German case, but anyone, any pro-migrant, let's say, actor, any supporter of migrants in Italy, from any kind of political, let's say, side, could be happy if there was such a measure. So I think, I don't know, it is a very hard task for us to, let's say, to propose innovative measures, and let's say it is hard for us to be listened by policymakers. So I don't know. I stop here.
Okay, thank you, Iraklis. I see Shaden is raising her hand. Maybe we take that before we move on to the last two speakers. We're coming closer to the end. So yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I will just make a very short comment regarding the implementing integration program on local authorities or different places regarding integrating refugees, whether into the labor market or to the academic to vocational training, or to gain any kind of like educational background regarding the courses to learn the language, especially the German language, since my research is about Germany. So I would speak about the integration program that are implemented here in Germany. I would like to say that through the interviews that I have conducted with the Syrian refugees, a lot of them has reported that we have been assigned to classes. For example, I'm at the age of 53 and my colleague was 18 years old or 20 years old. I have a degree in pharmacy, and the one who was sitting next to me was a hairdresser. So they have been sent to these integrational courses without looking at their backgrounds. And of course, the learning abilities and the learning style are different from one person to another, depending on many different factors regarding their educational background, their age sectors, their ability to learn. Some refugees, they had no education in their home country, and they were asked or they were enrolled in the same integrational classes with those who hold university degree. High academic level were put in the same classes with some other refugees who never went to schools back in Syria. The age plays a very major role again. People with the age of 20, they have different learning abilities from those who are in their 50s. So regarding kind of implementing better integration program for refugees, I think the background of each refugee, his age, his educational background, learning abilities should be put into consideration. Thank you.
Indeed, this is also a very important consideration for thinking from the perspective of regularization and what kind of a pathway that would mean for different groups, indeed. Deniz, do you have some last words and reactions?
Maybe just a short reaction to Zeynep Hocam. I totally agree that this informality that she mentioned is creating a space for maneuver for the migrants. But at the same time, it is also creating a space for maneuver for the governments as well. I mean, like the entire policy of the government of Turkey with regards to migration seems to be like creating gray spaces. I mean, nothing is black and white. Nothing is not. I mean, like, and within these gray spaces, they want to actually be able to flexible as much as possible within their policy making efforts. And in a recent study, I mean, I know that Zeynep Hocam has been following, but we have actually done a follow-up study about the situation of Afghans, but this time we looked at it from the reception of Afghans. I mean, like we talked to institutions that have been helping them while they were arriving to Turkey, and we realized that, again, I mean, in this article we said non-deportability, and in that report we are saying non-reception, and non being again in a parentheses, because the entire system is about not receiving them formally. I mean, letting them stay in formality. But I think this is not only creating, as I said, flexibility for the migrants, but it's also creating flexibility for the government as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deniz. Monika?
So a very last comment. Thank you very much for this, for pointing to selectiveness by Zeynep. I would like to say that if we, like policymakers, we studied them indirectly, I would say, because through empirical material that came from interviews with humanitarian migrants, but also through analyzing legal changes and statistics, public statistics. So let's say the effects of what policymakers and the authorities are doing in this field. We were studying this issue, so I wouldn't say that it was direct analysis of intentions of policymakers. So we studied this, and we saw that this selectiveness in the area of humanitarian. Let's say humanitarian and humanitarian considerations are like mixed, or these humanitarian considerations are completely ignored in case of some migrant groups, which has to be taken into account. And maybe this is the task for the academia, not only the CSO academia, to try to influence and give the evidence and encourage to critical insights of policymakers that these efforts like their intentions should be understood, but also like not only age of migrants, humanitarian migrants matter, but their situation and many other factors have to be taken into account. So the agency of people as well. So this selectiveness can be a danger, as we can see, especially if it is taken like for granted without any critical insights. And about regularization, from this is last point I wanted to say, that this can be a durable solution, but we also have some evidence that this is not regularization can work, but people then lose regular status, which is a problem. So this is maybe a recommendation for the future, and I'm referring also to the Polish case, recommendation for the future that this regularization in case of humanitarian migrants, not overstayers, economic migrants, factors, or I don't know, the details of such programs has to be thoroughly thought of, because otherwise it will be like another chance, and then people get back again to irregular status. So we do not solve the problems in a durable way. So thank you so much for this.
Great, thank you very much, Monika. I think indeed we sort of in different comments address this regularization issue, but just a tiny word from me too. I see in the chat that Marieke also responded to the question about why we don't start from regularization, because indeed that is less and less the trend. But thanks for mentioning the fact that indeed regularization does not necessarily mean permanency in most cases, and this is because indeed, as we are hinting at here, at the strategic interconnections between the return and tolerated stay in different articles that are a part of this special issue. And now also Deniz mentioned their work on non-reception. It really tells us, right? That is not the starting point. That's not the place where policy makers are coming from, at least at this moment. So what we would like to stress in the closing, and we're over time, so I will just take a very short few minutes to conclude. It's indeed very important to consider durability for whom, and at the same time, we also would like to stress that the focus should be not where solutions are most durable, but how they are durable. So that would mean then taking really a migrant-centered approach and consider indeed the specific circumstances that people find themselves in different localities. And of course, not only singling out these people, but taking into consideration the interactions between host and displaced communities and the possible destabilizing effects that displacement could also create in places where people are being hosted. This is something that we also come in the conclusion. I would like to also highlight it once more, that this would require us to think really beyond place-based, place-bound understandings of social cohesion. Durability may actually require facilitating this connection and further mobility, because sometimes people actually cope with return or ideas about stability through being mobile in different ways, right? Maintaining transnational livelihoods. And final remark, we are watching a genocide unfolding in Gaza. Rather less visible atrocities are happening in Afghanistan, Sudan, or elsewhere. And they will eventually, if not yet, cause new waves of displacement. At the same time, we are constantly being reminded that we are at the brink of a climate catastrophe, which at the heart of which is climate justice discussions, and at the heart of which lies mobility justice for communities whose ancestral lands are becoming unlivable. So as world citizens, whatever our position is, university, policymaker, practice, we all have all the more reason to push harder to think or envision policies that at their core sees mobility as a natural human response to unstable environments. Policies that are, instead of prioritizing migration control or mobility control or stasis, that are ready to embrace mobility. And as promised in the Global Compact on Migration's title, to offer safe, orderly, and regular migration for everyone, regardless of their passports. I would like to thank all of you for joining and staying with us. Stay safe and stay connected, I say. Take care.